the Wade Center's podcast.
The podcast of Wheaton College.
My impression was that the students at Magdalen College, his college, were concerned because the war had broken up September 1st, 1939. Germany invaded Poland. World War I was supposed to have been the war to end all wars.
Right.
But Hitler had used his machination and his army power, military power, in the Spanish Civil War and just wiped out the opposition. And people realized this mechanized war was going to trump the war to end all wars. And you can't walk through the old Oxford colleges without seeing the names etched all over the walls of people who died.
Oh, every little village in England has a memorial to all the males from their village who went to the war.
Although he talks already about serving in the Home Guard and this guy that couldn't believe that when they talked about how the world, remember he says, early in this war, a laboring man who was doing a midnight Home Guard with another educated man and myself. So he's already talking about being in the Home Guard, which wasn't established immediately. So this is sometime, we need to get that chronologically, Lewis, and find out when.
But you just said it was at the start of the war, but that doesn't prove.
He said it was the start of the war. I said somewhere in the middle of the war.
I think you're right, that could be a clue to helping establish approximately when the thing was given.
I think we should just say early in the war, or else we're going to get corrected. Because I don't think Churchill established the Home Guard. I'm pretty sure it wasn't until at least the 40s. I mean, at least 40 or 41.
Well, they were worried because they were having German pilots parachute out of their shot down planes and stuff. And they were worried about maybe the Germans dropping paratroopers behind the lines and setting up some skullduggery.
Well, we should mention that. And we should go ahead and start rolling. Yes. Because, people won't know if they read this, they may not know what the Home Guard is.
Yeah.
They call it the Dad's Army.
Let's start.
I'm going to look up the date that Joel says.
Okay, good.
Give me 2 seconds.
Oh, okay.
The date of what?
Of this lecture come about.
All right, here you go. Perhaps in this year's Jack's De Futilitate is delivered at Magdalen College in an evening speech prior to May 9th, the end of World War II, at the request of Sir Henry Tizard, then president of Magdalen College, probably to a group of undergraduates.
So prior to the end, I mean, that could be 3 years.
Right.
Well,
I mean,
he says,
39 was prior to the end.
Prior to May 9th. He says the opening paragraph speaks to this present war as though it's still going on, and the essay refers to an experience Lewis had early one Saturday morning with the local defense volunteers, which began in July 1940.
Yeah, that's David's point.
40.
This date is David C. Downing's best guess based on this present
war.
The sense of futility in the first half of the war and Jack's service in the Home Guard.
So
it doesn't say that, does it?
It does.
It's David Downing's?
It says this date is David C. Downing's best guess based on the present war.
There's this old story about a woman back in the days when you would get the calls that would come into a switchboard operator.
Right.
And every day she would get a call just before noon and somebody would be asking for the time and she'd give them the time day after day after day after day. Finally, one day out of curiosity, she said, you call every day. I recognize your voice. Who are you and why do you call? And he says, I'm the guy who sets the village clock and I get my time from you. She goes, I set my clock by the village clock. And we just these things go around and
talk
around.
About Dave Filatato.
I thought you were just kidding.
No.
Where did I talk about that?
I don't know. It's in a footnote, and I'd have to pull it back up, but he actually footnotes when you mention it.
Really?
Yeah.
If it's Joel
Heck, Jerry Root is probably wrong on this speculation.
If it's Joel Heck, it must be right.
Yeah, exactly.
And then if we find where his source is, what can we say?
Joel quotes me. It's like, it's like the lady with the clock. Yeah.
Okay, can we start now?
Yes.
It's sad that we don't have all of this in it.
Yeah. Well, we
can. That's why I started recording.
That's good. It's really good.
Welcome, and perhaps you've been listening already to the Wade Center podcast. I am Dr. Crystal Downing, and I am joined by my co-director at the Wade, Dr. David Downing, and we have the delightful conversational partners of our producer, Aaron Hill, and world-traveling speaker, Dr. Jerry Root. And we are planning to discuss 2 essays by C.S. Lewis that appear in a book that was put together by Walter Hooper called Christian Reflections. But David, why don't you tell our listeners about how we reached out about these essays?
Oh, I was just going to mention a story that I knew Jerry was going to be in town, which is a rare occasion. I was hoping he could join us. So I tried to dictate a message that said, please join us for recording on the Christian Reflections. The 2 essays we're going to be talking about are A Seeing Eye and De Futilitate. And the message said, we're going to be talking about the CIA and the futile latte. So that would be a whole different podcast, wouldn't it? So we hope you came prepared to talk about these 2 essays in Christian Reflections.
Well,
Jerry.
I drank my futile latte before I got here.
There you go. It's like eating crow is drinking futile latte.
Okay, I want to begin with the interesting opening line of this essay because Lewis doesn't do this very often, where he acknowledges the person who asked him to give the talk.
Let's go back one step. De Futilitate means on futility.
Right.
For people who think it's a recipe or something, we should make sure we translate the title.
Okay. And he says, when I was asked to address you, Sir Henry Tizard suggested that the problem of futility was likely to be present to many of your minds. And of course, that's because they were in the middle of World War II. Now, Henry Tizard is fascinating because he was a distinguished chemist, so he was a scientist and the president of Magdalen College. So he is asking C.S. Lewis, this Christian professor at Magdalen, to give this talk. But Tizard is quite distinguished, and this may be why Lewis mentions him, because Lewis is very concerned about the relationship between Christianity and science, which comes up in this as well as many other essays. And Tizard is actually the chemist who came up with the octane rating that we still use to classify gasoline.
Oh, wow.
And he also ignited the development of radar in 1935. And so that really helped the Allied forces.
Yeah.
In fact, I didn't know that it was Tizard's organization then that communicated radar to the USA. And here's just an interesting little tidbit. David's father was on the first American plane that tested the effectiveness of radar.
Really?
Wow.
Yeah, he was on the West Virginia, and they had a mail plane. They could launch a plane to go to the mainland. And so they went into a cloud bank, and the guy back on the ship said, you just went up 1,000 feet. And they said,
wow.
That's right. And he said, you just turned left 30 degrees. They said it was really spooky because normally a fighter plane going into a cloud bank was a way to just disappear from the enemy. And so Dad said it was going to be a whole new war with radar. You were able to follow these airplanes coming in.
See, you have a connection with this essay because of your dad and Sir Henry Tizard, a genetic connection.
Yes, someone should name their child Tizard.
I used to have a lizard. Does that?
Well, Jerry, why don't you get us started talking about this essay? What do you like about it?
Well, two things. I think to jump into it, Lewis says futility is the opposite of utility. And utility speaks of the purpose of a thing. And so you have to understand what the overall purpose is before you can even make a judgment on its being futile. And he also, so that's going to open up a whole area of discussion we could get into later. But I think the key phrase or the key sentence in this is, all judgments imply a standard. So what is the basis by which you make your judgment? Is it self-referential? Is it projective? Is it science? Is it logic that's inferentially developed? Or is it owing to something that's transcendent that validates your judgments or a proper assessment of reality? So all those things start to open up with this one question or this one statement. All judgments imply a standard.
Right.
How interesting then that he's mentioning Sir Henry Tizard at the start, because radar was something that you couldn't see and yet was identified as establishing the truth. And Lewis is drawing attention to the fact that World War II, which all these students were having to grapple with, wondering whether they're going to be sent out to fight, even a scientist who is a materialist and says, well, there's no truth other than empirically verifiable reality, even a popular evolutionist, as he talks about in this essay, who says we're getting more progressive. Even an atheist would say that what Hitler was doing, especially to the Jews as it was becoming more apparent, is wrong. And where do those scientific materialists get their sense of right and wrong? There has to be something that transcends material reality.
Can we back up a little bit and talk about, I feel like he introduces the topic of futility, and he lays a little bit of groundwork, and then as he often does, he uses that to just kind of launch off into something else that he wants to a bigger thing he wants to talk about. Not that they're not related, but he just sort of sets up at the beginning. And you mentioned earlier, David, this story about a working class man that was serving with him on the home guard. It has this moment of realization that even after the war's over, that it's not like there's never going to be another war. And so he has this moment, he says, the entirely novel idea sank in, and at the last breaking out, then what's the good of the ruddy world going on? And he has this moment where he realizes, what's the whole point of all this if nothing that we do is going to last? What's the point of fighting and going and dying in war? And, what are we fighting for if the victory that we won in World War I wasn't permanent? It wasn't the war to end all wars. And here we are again. What's the point of continuing to do this? And eventually Lewis kind of boils it down. He talks about Earth as sort of like a sinking ship, right? And he asks the question, like, what's the point of, cleaning up and keeping the sinking ship in good order if it's going to sink? How are we going to have any sort of eschatological hope in the universe if we know that everything's just going to end in heat death?
Eschatological meaning pertaining to the end times.
Last things.
Right.
Yeah,
Even more heartbreaking than that is Lewis beginning his essay talking about how he, as a boy, felt life was futile.
Yeah.
And of course, it's because his mother died not long before he turned 9 years old. No wonder he became an atheist. So he experienced the feelings of futility. So he's really talking about something that he has grappled with.
Yeah. I think his key turning point, though, the way he shifts from that is he brings up this idea that essentially the world is futile if we assume that it was made for just us, that it was made for just humanity. And then that leads him into saying, like, well, maybe it was made not just for us, maybe it was made for something more, and maybe there's something more that's behind it, and that leads him into his sort of later discussion. But I thought it was very interesting how he starts off with embracing what they were going through. He doesn't dismiss it. He doesn't just jump straight to some sort of, here's what the book of Revelation says, here's the hope.
The easy answer.
Yeah.
And not just us, but just us in this moment. So it becomes meaningful if we could extend our moment.
Yeah.
And consequently, he says that's denying the reality of history. All human life has been lived on a precipice. And the other thing that's interesting is he makes a comment in here. We want to make sense of our experience. What's that about? Doesn't that say there's something transcendent? Why do we want to make sense if it's all meaningless?
Yeah.
And so he's got this one comment. Our sense that the universe is futile and our sense of a duty to make those parts of it we can reach less futile both really imply a belief that it is not in fact futile at all, a belief that values are rooted in reality outside ourselves, that the reason in which the universe is saturated is also moral.
Yeah.
We want to make sense of it. We want a duty to do the best we can to make sense of it and live our lives well in the midst of it. That is both transcendent in its grasp, in its stretch, and it's also moral. We have a duty. We have a sense of obligation in the midst of it.
Yeah.
You see somebody who's dying and you don't say to them, well, they're dying, just let them go. You do all you can to help them. Why is that? And so I think that Lewis is moving in that direction as well.
Yeah.
I love this one line where he says, evolutionism is the idea that humans are getting better and better. And even evolutionists say most mutations are negative. But at the end of the paragraph, he says, organic life is only a lightning flash in cosmic history. In the long run, nothing will come of it. Part of the reason I like Lewis is his honesty.
Yeah.
A lot of people would start out saying, well, don't have futility. I mean, there's God's in his heaven and all's right with the world. But if you look at his World War I poetry, he felt atheism and despair and futility in his bones and sinews.
Yeah.
And he had to work his way out of that. A lot of Christian apologists aren't very effective because their starting point is so far ahead of where the average agnostic or atheist would be. I've had people actually quoting the Bible saying, yeah, but the Bible says, and the atheist is going, well, I don't believe the Bible. Why are you quoting the Bible to me? But I think his negative background, he talks about his glands. It's almost like predating the idea of having low serotonin levels.
Well, what I like is that he sort of doubles down on the futility to the point where he says, well, look, it's actually, the problem's even worse than you think.
Right.
Because if he gives this example, he says, it's just as the man who warns the newcomer, don't trust anyone in this office, always expects you to trust him at that moment.
Yeah, right.
His insight that I love, and the line that really stood out to me in this, was when he says, verification involves inference. He comes back to inference being the cornerstone of reason, that the thing that we can hang our hat on is our ability to infer something is true from something else, basically logic, and that forms the backbone of not just scientific thought, but of theology and all forms of thought, everything in the university, like you were talking about, Jerry.
Even Darwin and J.B.S. Haldane worried about that. If our brain activity is an evolutionary survival mechanism, how do we know it actually is helping us understand external reality?
And he even names Haldane in this essay. And I thought he had a vexed relationship with Haldane.
He did. Haldane was one of the speakers at the Socratic Club. Haldane wrote an essay called Old Horny FRS. Old Horny is a slang for Satan. And he wrote an essay critiquing Lewis's anti-scientism and the idea that it's diabolical. Lewis wrote a really great reply, but he never published it.
Really?
Explaining that Haldane had misinterpreted Lewis's ideas about science. Yeah. Lewis realized there were as many Christians in the sciences as there were in the humanities. Yeah. But his villains tend to be scientists. Look up Haldane in Wikipedia. He was a real interesting person. Personally, he came across a little bit like Oscar Wilde. He came across like Oscar Wilde, but then he was this real ferocious Marxist. He gave up his British citizenship and took an Indian citizenship because he was so disgusted with capitalism.
Oh, wow.
So he was an interesting figure. And
interesting.
Many people think that Weston in Out of the Silent Planet is actually based on Haldane.
Yeah, which makes it interesting that he cites Haldane to make the point that even Haldane considers progressive evolution to be rare.
Yeah.
So that cements his antipathy to this modernist and what he calls the popular view of evolution.
Yeah.
That, humans are getting better and better. And that's not true.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though, you mentioned Oscar Wilde, who, by the way, went to Magdalen College, Oxford. But Oscar Wilde, while he's in prison, he ends up writing a book called De Profundis.
Right.
And he talks about coming to faith in that time. So he's looking for something that transcends this futile life, and he finds it during the time of his incarceration.
And of course, De Profundis comes from the beginning of the Psalm.
Out of the depths.
Yeah.
Well, Haldane, when he debated Lewis at the Socratic Club, he read his paper, and normally the format was Lewis would get up and challenge them, and it would kind of go from a paper into a debate. And Haldane read his paper against Christianity, and then he just walked toward the door. He didn't stick around for
Yeah, we talked about that in our previous podcast.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's fine. Yeah, no, that's good.
Yeah.
I wanted to just read a quote. I like the phrase that occurs towards the end where he sums everything up. He comes back to futility by saying, in a word, unless we allow ultimate reality to be moral, we cannot morally condemn it. And so his way he gets back to futility is by saying, okay, we can't say the universe is futile unless we embrace, like you said, this idea of a standard. And if there's a standard, then that applies, there's a morality behind it. And so he kind of gets back to saying, your sense that things feel futile is actually a confirmation of the fact that you feel like there is a purpose.
Something greater.
There's something greater. So then he recommends that they want to investigate this more, that they study theology.
Well, picking up on your stressing of the importance of inferences and sound inferences. He's showing how there's a false inference if you say life is not moral, life is futile, and so on. And he's saying you can't morally condemn it unless you begin with the presupposition that it is moral, and now we think inferentially about it. And he's showing them the falsehood of their inferences.
This comes up in a lot of his books. He says, in Surprised by Joy, I was mad at God for making such an imperfect world, and I was also mad at him for not existing.
Right.
He said, he quotes Hausman saying, whatever brute and blackguard made this world. And he says, well, that brute and blackguard must have given me the moral sense by which I assess him to be a brute and blackguard.
Yeah. Exactly.
So he really likes that argument that you can't really judge the cosmos or God unless you figure out what standard you're using.
You get the sense sometimes, I get the sense sometimes when I read these essays and I see these themes come up and again, that, you know, we talk about the walk through the trees at Magdalen College and the conversation he had with Tolkien, and you get the sense that these are also some of the things that he couldn't get away from in his own atheism, that he kept coming back to, that kept tripping him up. Does it make sense? It sort of led him back to theism before he becomes a Christian.
In the Abolition of Man, he talks about objective reality, the Tao, the doctrine of objective reality, the belief that certain things are really true and other things really false, the kind of thing we are and the kind of thing the universe is. He says, but those who would reject the Tao, if they reject it, they're making a judgment. What's the basis of their standard? And he talks about utility, he talks about economic value, he talks about instinct. But he says anybody who's going to reject the Tao has to pull bits and pieces of the Tao to validate their rejection. And they reject part of it, but they keep part of it, and they're being inconsistent and incoherent in their argument.
Yeah,
and
it's
he
like
makes
a
that
tapestry
strongly.
that has many strands, and you can't pull on one strand.
Yep.
Michael Ward, in his book, The End of Humanity, calls it moral ecology. There's this delicate balance of all these different principles of taking care of your family, of being a good neighbor, of being... And if you just, one of them, my family and my tribe, that is my main value, then you become a Nazi and you're able to persecute all the other families and the other tribes.
Yeah.
And so there's a kind of an ecology that all these moral principles are almost checks and balances for each other.
The other interesting thing he mentions in here, which we need to get to the next essay, but the other interesting thing he mentions is this idea, and he does this in a bunch of other places, is where he essentially connects. He says it's not just human thought or human reasoning or this human ability to infer, but it has to be higher. It has to be something that exists sort of outside of us. And if it exists outside of us, he eventually connects it to a person, there's a personal being that actually has thought.
And that makes a good segue to this next essay that has been named by Walter Hooper, The Seeing Eye, because he talks about space travel and those people who say, oh, we've discovered there are these universes, thousands of universes beyond ours, which proves God doesn't exist. So how space travel has been used to justify atheism.
Well, there's a famous incident. This was written in the 60s.
Yes, this was 1963.
There's a famous incident where a Russian cosmonaut said,
Yuri Gagarin.
I looked out the window and I didn't see God.
Yeah. Well, and Lewis references.
Can I just read the opening that he says here? Because it's so good. And then, so he says, the Russians, I am told, report they have not found God in outer space. On the other hand, a good many people in many different times and countries claim to have found God or have been found by God here on Earth. The conclusion some of us want to draw from these data is that God does not exist.
The thing that's kind of funny about this is when that happened, I mean, I remember it. I remember when he said, I was in outer space, there is no God. I didn't see him when I was there. And there was a pastor of Dallas First Baptist Church, W.A. Criswell, who got in his pulpit that Sunday after this happened. And he said, why, if that Soviet cosmonaut really wanted to see God, all he would have had to have done was get outside of his space capsule and he would have seen him in a hurry. Lewis is addressing the same issue, but he's taking a little more developed, rational, deliberate, inferentially proper approach.
Our local pastor back in Colorado said, well, if he looked in his reflection in the window, that would have been a good image of God.
The Imago Dei, yeah. Let me talk about the context before we talk about the essay more. This was published in a 1963, February 1963 issue of an American magazine called Show. And they must have reached out to him because this was a magazine that would do essays about Playboy bunnies, and it was a magazine of the arts. And so it was kind of considered itself an avant-garde magazine. In fact, the issue in which Lewis's essay appears has a naked woman on the front of the magazine, but you can't see her body parts because there's an X-ray machine in front of the significant parts. But on the cover, adjacent to this woman with the X-ray machine in front of her, and earlier magazines had Sophia Loren on the cover. I don't think Lewis really
Understood
had seen the magazine before he
wasn't a
to do
subscriber.
It. But the cover says...
They had a picture of Lewis stretched out on a bearskin rug. That was very unusual for Lewis.
And they say space race towards a renaissance. So they wanted the issue to be about the space race. So they probably reached out to Lewis because of his Ransom trilogy about going to outer space. But they named it Onward Christian Spacemen.
Mm-hmm. That's what they call this article.
Yeah. Which sounds a bit mocking.
Yeah.
It's like they didn't expect him to get so serious in this essay. And just another little tidbit before we talk about the essay. This Henry Tizard that he mentioned in Tizard he mentioned in the earlier essay. He was ignited a study of UFOs in England. So Tizard is kind of related to this essay as well. Okay, let's talk about the essay.
The content, though, he says, trying to find God in outer space is like trying to look for Shakespeare in all of his plays.
Yeah, it's a great analogy.
But you can read all of his plays and you're not going to find him. But if you said to somebody you didn't believe in Shakespeare because you didn't find him in his plays, nobody would take you very seriously.
Right. And he got that straight out of Dorothy Sayers. That's what she talks about in The Mind of the Maker, which C.S. Lewis described as an indispensable book. So he borrowed that metaphor.
Lewis uses the metaphor of theater often to talk about theological issues. Even in Surprised by Joy, he talks about how he didn't think he could know God personally any more than Hamlet could know Shakespeare. And then he comes, after that talk with Tolkien, he comes to the realization Hamlet could have known Shakespeare not by tearing himself out of the play to get to know the author, but by the author writing himself into the play.
Right.
And making the introduction possible. And so then that now opens the door to some of the things that he's discussing in this particular essay.
Can I read a quote from this that I just got a huge kick out of this? It's obvious that he's taking a shot at some people here. He says, if there were an idiot who thought plays existed on their own, without an author, not to mention actors, producer, manager, stagehands, and whatnot, our belief in Shakespeare would be much affected by his saying quite truly that he had studied all the plays and never found Shakespeare in them. Mm-hmm. So I just thought that turn, like, if I were an idiot, I would think that you could put a play on without having all these people behind the scenes. He's taking a stab, obviously, at atheists who's, and those that, Yuri Gagarin here. But I thought it was pretty harsh language for an essay.
He also has that funny analogy of his tapping the ashes out of his pipe. And they spell out the word, we are the ashes from a pipe, How in the world do they randomly arrange themselves? Yeah, this is an amusing essay. I wanted to go back, Crystal, you mentioned Lewis's fiction. Part of the fascination of studying Lewis is how much his intellect and his imagination work together like two blades of scissors. In his essay, he says that in science fiction, they always have the same scientific understanding. When you go and meet aliens, they know about gravity and they know about light, but they have completely different morals.
Uh-huh. Or no morals at all.
Yeah, because apparently science is objective and morals are subjective.
Yeah, they're like Vulcans or something.
Right. But when in his own science fiction, he goes to Out of the Silent and Paralandra, and he discovers that Christian ethics are actually true and universal and cosmic, and it's the science which is negotiable.
Yeah.
So in his fiction, he decides to correct something which bothers him in science fiction, is the idea that morality is completely subjective.
Yeah, his worst character in all of his novels would be Weston, I think.
Right.
Who's the utter materialist who has no morals. And if he rejects the objective morality, then everything is self-referential. If you live in a world of self-referential morality, you end up with anarchy. And then if somebody could get power, then you end up with tyrannies.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, he points out in here, he says, this thought is welcome to me because, to be frank, I have no pleasure in looking forward to a meeting between humanity and an alien rational species. I observe how the white man has hitherto treated the black, and how even among civilized men, the stronger have treated the weaker. If we encounter in the depth of space a race, however innocent and amiable, which is technologically weaker than ourselves, I do not doubt that the same revolting story will be repeated. We shall enslave, deceive, exploit, or exterminate. At the very least, we shall corrupt it with our vices and infect it with our diseases. We are not fit yet to visit other worlds.
Yeah.
We have filled our own with massacre, torture, syphilis, famine, dust bowls, and all that is hideous to ear and eye. Must we go on to infect new realms?
Yeah. Ooh.
Lewis, when the Americans made it to the moon, he has a note in one of his letters, and he says, "The blackguards have violated the moon."
Yes.
He did not
He
see
mentions
that as
that in here, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, a great moment in human history.
He says, too, later in the essay, much depends upon the seeing eye. He says, what is required is a certain faculty of recognition. And this, again, would be a recognition that's outside of our own limited understanding. We're looking at reality. We're trying to understand it better. We're looking at reality and community and trying to gain a more robust view. It would be the kinds of things he talks about in his essay, membership, and the idea of being in community and trying to understand.
And also meditations in a tool shed, which we discussed in our last podcast, how so many people just look at the beam of light rather than saying, how does this assumption that there is a creator of the universe, how can we see reality different because of that truth?
Or that the one kind of thought can't necessarily tell you about the nature of something else, looking at it versus looking along it.
Right.
You can't necessarily jump from one to the other. So he makes that example in here. He says, physicists trying to probe behind the facade of reality can only give you mathematics. And mathematics may be true about the reality, but it can hardly be the reality itself, any more than contour lines are real mountains.
Well, he said elsewhere, science studies matter. If there's anything above and behind matter, science cannot say.
Yeah.
I think that's Yuri Gagarin's basic mistake.
Yeah.
Is thinking if you examine more and more matter, you'll find God. I wanted to go back to the whole paragraph that Jerry, you referenced, which gives this essay its title. Space traveling really has nothing to do with the matter. To some, God is discoverable everywhere. To others, nowhere. Those who do not find him on Earth are unlikely to find him in space. Hang it all, we're in space already. Every year we go on a huge circular tour in space.
I love that.
Yeah. But send a saint up in a spaceship and he'll find God in space as he found God on Earth. Much depends on the seeing eye.
Right.
So
your
that's where
presuppositions that you bring.
Even
right.
when they're watching the creation in Magician's Nephew, Diggory is very excited to see this lion bringing this empty world into being, life and light and living beings, whereas his uncle Andrew is terrified of the lion. And Lewis says, much of what you see depends upon who you are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He says, too, I doubt a person would really find mystery on the moon if they couldn't find mystery in their own backyard.
Right.
Right.
It's a kind of eye I'm bringing, seeing eye I'm bringing to the experience. And Chesterton makes a comment like that, too. He says, the world will never starve for want of wonders, only for want of wonder.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So if a person doesn't have that sense of wonder.
I was thinking of Chesterton, too, because Lewis makes a comment in this essay. One might imagine a play in which the dramatist introduced himself as a character into his own play. And then he goes on to say, such a play doesn't exist. Well, actually, Chesterton wrote a play about an author who enters into the play itself, and it wasn't published in his lifetime, but Dorothy Sayers was asked to write an introduction to it in 1951 when Sheldon Ward published it.
Oh, wow.
And what Chesterton did, what's really interesting, it's called The Surprise. And what is fascinating is it kind of shows that it has two acts, one in which the author enters and just kind of fixes everything up and makes things work out the way people want. And then the second act, the author doesn't enter, but allows the freedom of will among the actors.
There's something similar to In the very decade that Lewis is speculating could Hamlet break out of the play to get to know the author. So that's in the 1920s, just before his conversion, late 20s. That same decade, Luigi Pirandello, the Sicilian playwright, wrote a play called Six Characters in Search of an Author.
Yeah.
So you got 6 characters on the stage and they're rehearsing, and 6 other characters break in, and a big philosophical discussion opens up on, are there authors? Do we exist in a world of our own, or is there something transcendent? And they end in despair. They don't think you could get to know the author.
Oh, wow.
And of course you couldn't if you began from a human perspective.
Yeah.
The author has to make himself known.
Yeah.
Right.
And he makes himself known at least 2 ways, right? In nature, heavens declare the glory of God, earth shows his handiwork, or in divine revelation, objective revelation. And you've got that then later in that same Psalm, Psalm 19, which Lewis said was his favorite psalm, by the way. You've got, when you start with verse 7, we start saying the testimony of the Lord, the testimony, the statutes of the Lord, the commandments of the Lord. So the early reference to God is the Hebrew word El, which is a generic name for God. We can know some things about him. But if you want to know him intimately and personally, he now uses Yahweh, the Tetragrammaton, when he talks about the revelation in Scripture.
And he reveals that. He says, he reveals, God reveals that. He says, this is my name. This is, what I want you to call me, as opposed to generic.
There's a charming poem by Robert Frost called Revelation, and he compares playing hide and seek, and you hide so well that nobody can find you, and you have to come out and say, here I am. He compares that to God at some point, saying, well, they don't seem to be finding me, so he finally comes out and reveals himself.
That's good.
Look it up. It's called Revelation by Robert Frost. It's really a charming poem.
He mentions in here Dante and how Dante writes himself in, and then he talks also about Jesus and sort of being born in the incarnation. So he is connecting the dots here.
Well, Lewis does that too. In The Great Divorce, he writes himself in.
Yeah.
Right.
He finds himself in hell.
He loved blurring the boundaries between the factual world we live in and the fictional world of his imagination. He always wants you to go, is there more going on than just the real world around us?
The distinction he makes is, in Dante's story, the characters are only doing what he wants them to do. So he's having a conversation with people and he's putting the words in their mouth. So it's just really him talking with himself. But then when he talks about Jesus, he says, the difference here is that he's created people that have free will, that are, independent creatures in terms of their own minds and have their own rationality. And so there's an element of freedom involved with interacting with creation.
That's a really good point, Aaron. I think, too, again, Lewis uses theater and drama as a means of communicating the sort of 2-story universe. You've got the author's world and you've got the character's world. But as Lewis writes about that sort of thing, you start thinking about what makes for a good play.
Yeah.
And it's not when the author puts his ideas in all the good characters and what he disagrees with in the bad characters.
Yes.
If you see a good play, all the characters are believable. Thomas Stoppard is brilliant at it. And also there was another one I saw. Freud's Last Session. I don't know if you've seen that play.
Right.
And it's a dialogue. They know 2 weeks before he took his life, Freud had one last counseling session, and it was with an Oxford Don. And somebody speculated, based on that class that Armand Nicolai taught at Harvard, Freud and Lewis, that what if it would have been Lewis who came for that session? And I've seen the play, I've read the play. Both characters are believable. Both make points. Both concede points. But at the end of the play, I think Lewis came out stronger because Lewis had something worth living for, and Freud took his life. And there was a dramatic difference there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another Christian author contemporary with Lewis, Mikhail Bakhtin, who was exiled because he was a Christian under Stalin, he wrote something very similar about Dostoevsky, about especially the Brothers Karamazov, how Dostoevsky is putting a little bit of himself into every single one of the characters, the believing characters, the skeptical characters, those who commit crimes because he understands them. And of course, G.K. Chesterton also has something like that in one of his Father Brown mysteries, where the reason Father Brown, this priest, is able to solve a crime is because he says, I look into my own heart and I understand that kind of evil because I've felt it myself.
Crystal, this is really interesting to me. This author that you said, Dostoevsky put himself into each of the characters, a little bit of himself into each of the characters. That's very intriguing. And does he say that he's speculating that was so, or does he have some knowledge? Did Dostoevsky write something in a letter or something like that?
It was through study of Dostoevsky. Mikhail Bakhtin was a very respected literary critic.
So
in Russia.
he's making a judgment. That's his assumption about it.
Right.
It's a really brilliant insight, I think.
I think it's pretty easy to justify. In Brothers Karamazov, the father has 3 sons, one who's very spiritual, one who's very intellectual, and one who's very sensual. But the father's name is Fyodor.
Yeah,
as
his
in
own
Fyodor
name.
Dostoevsky.
His own name.
Yeah.
So you have a feeling that these are all manifestations of his character.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Now, there's another great work of art, which I think we're neglecting. When I was in college at Westmont, we had a filmmaking course. And one of the films that my group made, we were showing it in this little room. It's like a box theater with a door in the front. And for our film, the film starts and it's just the front of the room with this door. There's nothing happening.
Mm.
And you wait for about 30 seconds. There's an uncomfortable silence. And then I'm in the front row wearing blue jeans and this very distinctive plaid shirt. And I get up in the actual room and go out the door. And then I come in the door of the film. And I say, I'm so sorry. We had a little trouble in the background, but that's the nature of art. You try to capture reality, but there's always some imperfections, and what you try to construct is never as good of a representation of reality as you're hoping for. So I do apologize, but I do hope you appreciate this film. And then I walk out the door in the movie, and then I come back in the room, and now it's just the front of the room again. And I've been waiting for the Pulitzer Prizes. I've been waiting for the accolades.
Did you make that up?
Oscar?
Did you make that up?
No, this is a real film we made.
It has a little feel of Waiting for Godot in it.
Yeah, it's a little bit like that. It's also like a Woody Allen movie, A Purple Rose and Cairo. But it was funny to me, the audience reaction was, that was so strange. Did you know when you made the movie that it was? I go, of course we knew.
The whole thing was planned. Yeah.
Somehow they thought that I had performed this act of magic.
Yeah. Well, I think that's, to generalize here and bring it back to Lewis, I think that's one of the reasons why he's so persuasive in these essays is he gives such credence to the kind of thinking that would, lead you down these atheist paths because he's gone there before.
Right.
He's had those thoughts. He's dealt with them himself. So even at the opening of this, he like takes it so seriously that he's like, well, there's 4 options that we have. And he goes through and he lists them. Maybe we need to just, go further out into space and we'll find him.
Yeah.
Maybe God's a local deity. He's only for our solar system, He goes through all these different
They
options.
sailed a long way on the ocean before they found.
Yeah. Or maybe
North
God was out
America.
there and the Russians didn't have the right equipment to detect him or something. And you kind of get the sense that he's joking, but he also seems to be taking the idea seriously. And then he pursues one of the paths and takes you through it, from A to B. And so it's just, I don't know, that's one of the things I appreciate about reading his essays is he doesn't come up with a dismissive response right off the bat.
Yeah.
He takes his critics seriously,
Yeah.
and then he does this like logical jujitsu and turns their force back against them.
Yeah.
It is brilliant. That's a good observation.
Because you
And
brought up
then the use of
Chesterton.
the fertile imagination in the process of doing that
Yeah.
too.
Right. I'll say, Crystal brought up Chesterton. Chesterton said, to say there was no God in the universe is like saying there were no insects anywhere among the stars. I mean, how exactly do you know? That would take a lot of empirical investigation.
And Lewis writes about that too. He says negative knowledge is harder to assert than positive knowledge. For me to say there's no spider in this room, I'd have to check every nook and cranny.
Yeah.
For me to say there is a spider, I could see one scurrying across the floor.
Right.
But Lewis says, obviously, arguments for God's existence are more complex than seeing a spider scurry across the floor, but the analogy still stands. The person who makes this universal judgment, there is no God, is assuming that they have grasp of everything. And I have never talked to an atheist where they've stayed an atheist longer than 10 minutes. and except Madeline Murray O'Hara, I had an hour-long discussion with her one
Really?
time.
Wow.
And she confided in me, I am an atheist because I'm promiscuous and I choose to be promiscuous, and therefore to be a believer in God would be contrary to my lifestyle. But I was with
But then her son became a Christian, right?
her son not only became a Christian, he became a pastor, he became a Christian apologist, and he's now a missionary in Syria.
Wow.
Wow.
So the thing is though, I was with a friend of mine out in Half Moon Bay, and we were looking out over this outcropping and seeing the waves breaking on the rocks before. It was beautiful. This couple came riding up on their bicycles, and we just were admiring the beauty. We were talking about, this is glorious. And then all of a sudden I said, isn't it nice to know who to give thanks to for this? And the guy got huffy all of a sudden. He says, I'm an atheist. And I said, I'll bet I can prove to you in 10 minutes you're not. And so I did the thing about the spider, but also the Widener Library at Harvard has 19 million volumes under that one roof. I said, have you read all those? How do you know there isn't anything in any of those books that might count against your view, or anything that's been written in the past, or anything that might be written in the future? I think you've inflated your capacity to make the judgment you're making. I said, give me an honest agnostic over a dishonest atheist any moment.
Right.
And finally, 10 minutes later, he says, you're right, I'm not an atheist, I'm an agnostic. And I said, well, if you missed it on that one, maybe you missed it on the other one. And I said, I'd like to send you a book. He said, send me a book. What are you going to send me? I said, I'm going to send you C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. I didn't tell him how to get back in touch with me. I sent him the book. He reached me on email and wrote to me and said, this book has been very helpful to me.
Oh,
It's interesting, isn't it?
Wow.
Oh.
Yeah, but there's this inflated judgment.
Yeah.
You know, and this is the judgment of Yuri Gagarin too, and
Right.
others.
Yeah. Can I read one quote and then we can close?
Yes.
So this is a quote he had in this essay that it really hit home for me. So maybe it'll hit home for you. He's talking the question of, how can we find God in outer space? But then he turns in just for a brief moment in the essay is like the bigger question that we may need to ask is, how are we trying to avoid him? And he said, the avoiding in many times and places has proved so difficult that a very large part of the human race failed to achieve it. But in our own time and place, it is extremely easy. Avoid silence, avoid solitude, avoid any train of thought that leads off the beaten track. Concentrate on money, sex, status, health, and above all, on your own grievances. Keep the radio on, or as we might say, keep a podcast on. Live in a crowd.
Not ours.
Live in a crowd. Use plenty of sedation. If you must read books, select them carefully, but you'd be safer to stick to the papers. You'll find advertisements helpful, especially those with a sexy or a snobbish appeal.
Next week, we're going to do the hearing ear and the talking mouth.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, past collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.